The day Anna Ralston arrived in Caldwell, Kansas, the sky was the color of a bruise, and every man on the main street stopped what he was doing to stare at the woman stepping down from the stagecoach like she owned the ground beneath her boots. It was the spring of 1878, and Caldwell sat on the edge of everything. The edge of the cattle trails, the edge of Indian territory, the edge of what a person could survive if they were foolish enough to stay. The town was loud with the sound of horses and commerce, with the smells of leather and dust and ambition baking under a Kansas sun. Anna had read about places like this in letters, in newspaper articles, in the careful handwriting of her late father's journals. She had imagined them as romantic and wild. She had not imagined they would smell quite so strongly of cattle. She was 22 years old, with dark auburn hair pinned beneath a gray traveling bonnet, green eyes that caught the light like river water, and a set to her jaw that her mother had always called stubborn and her father had always called determined. She carried 2 bags, one with her clothes, one with her books, and she looked at the muddy, sun-bleached town of Caldwell, Kansas, with the expression of a woman who had made a decision and intended to see it through regardless of what the world had to say about it. The decision had been made in Philadelphia 3 months earlier, when the bank had come for her father's bookshop. Samuel Ralston had died of a fever the previous winter, leaving Anna with a modest inheritance that had been mostly eaten by debts, a mother who had already remarried and moved to Boston, and no particular desire to follow either the money or her mother eastward. Anna was not the kind of woman who followed. She was the kind of woman who moved toward something, and what she had moved toward was an advertisement in the Philadelphia Inquirer posted by a school board in Caldwell, Kansas, seeking a schoolteacher to instruct the children of the cattle town in reading, writing, and arithmetic. She had applied. She had been accepted. She had packed her 2 bags, kissed the air beside her mother's cheek, and boarded the first of several trains heading west. The schoolhouse was a small building at the north end of town, and the woman who met her there was Mrs. Dora Hicks, the wife of the town's land registrar and the head of the school board. Dora was a stout woman in her 50s with iron-gray hair and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who had built something from nothing and was not inclined to be impressed by people who hadn't. "You're younger than I expected," Dora said, looking Anna over with frank appraisal. "I'm also more qualified than you expected," Anna replied, "if you've read my letters." Dora studied her for a moment longer, then nodded once, the ghost of approval crossing her face. "Come inside. I'll show you the schoolroom, and then we'll get you settled at the boarding house." The schoolroom was a single long room with 8 wooden desks, a blackboard that needed chalk, and windows that let in more wind than light. Anna loved it immediately. She could see exactly what it needed and exactly how she would fill it, and the feeling of standing in the middle of a space waiting to be shaped was one of her deepest comforts. The boarding house was run by a widow named Mrs. Eliza Cobb, who was tall and thin, and moved through her own house with the quiet efficiency of someone who had long since made peace with doing everything herself. She showed Anna to a room on the 2nd floor with a window that looked out over the main street, a narrow bed, a washstand, and a hook on the wall for her coat. "Dinner is at 6, Mrs. Cobb said. "Breakfast at 6:30. I do not serve anything in between, and I would ask that you not bring men to your room." "That won't be a problem," Anna said. "It always is, eventually," Mrs. Cobb said, with the air of a woman who had seen a great many things come through her boarding house and was no longer surprised by any of them, and then she left Anna alone in her new room. Anna unpacked her books first. She was standing at the window, looking down at the main street in the blue light of early evening, when she first saw Isaac Carson. She did not know who he was then. She only saw a man riding a gray horse down the center of the street with the unhurried ease of someone who had nowhere urgent to be and nothing to prove about getting there. He was tall in the saddle, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled slightly at the ends where it touched the collar of his blue shirt, and he wore his hat pushed back just enough that she could see his face in profile as he passed, strong jaw, straight nose. The kind of expression that was serious without being unfriendly. He was perhaps 26 or 27, she judged. He rode like he had been born on horseback. He glanced up at the window, almost idly, and for just a moment their eyes met across the street and the evening air before he looked away again and continued down the road and around the corner toward the livery stable. Anna stepped back from the window and told herself she was hungry, and that was why her heart was beating a little faster than usual. She went down to dinner. She met Isaac Carson properly the following Thursday, which was also the day her schoolroom was broken into. She had arrived early that morning, as was her habit, to write the day's arithmetic problems on the blackboard before her 12 students arrived. She pushed open the door and found the room in disarray. 2 desks overturned, her globe knocked from its stand, and a rough word carved into the surface of her teacher's desk with what appeared to have been a hunting knife. The word was not one she intended to write down, but its meaning was clear. Whoever had done this did not want a schoolteacher in Caldwell, or at least not this one. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, breathing steadily, refusing to let the anger that rose in her throat spill into tears, because she was not going to cry in a schoolroom where 12 children would arrive in less than an hour, and she had things to teach them. She was writing the second desk when she heard boots on the step and a voice said, "Miss, are you all right?" She turned. The man in the doorway was Isaac Carson, up close now, and he was taller than he had looked from the window, with dark eyes that were currently taking in the state of the room with a calm, methodical attention that reminded her, oddly, of the way her father used to read a damaged book assessing the harm, already calculating what could be salvaged. "I'm perfectly fine," Anna said. "Someone has made a mess of my schoolroom, but I've dealt with worse." "Who would do this?" he asked, stepping inside and setting the second desk fully upright with one hand. "I couldn't say," she said, "but I intend to find out." She paused, realizing she was talking to a stranger. "I'm Anna Ralston. I'm the new schoolteacher." "Isaac Carson," he said, and touched the brim of his hat. "I run the Carson Ranch south of town. My nephew Tommy is one of your students, which is why I was heading this way this morning." She looked at him. "Is Tommy the kind of boy who overturns desks?" "No," Isaac said, and there was something quiet and certain in his voice that made her believe him without question. "Tommy is 9 years old, and he's been asking me every night for the past 2 weeks how many more days until school started." He was excited. Something in her chest eased. "I'm glad to hear it," she said, and turned back to the globe, which had rolled under the nearest desk and collected a coating of dust. Isaac crouched and retrieved it for her without being asked, turning it in his hands for a moment before passing it back. "I can ask around town," he said, "about who might have done this." "The Sheriff Hobbs is a good man," Isaac said carefully, "but he's got his hands full with the end of cattle season, and a broken schoolroom might not be at the top of his list. I know most of the people in this county. Let me ask around." She looked at him steadily for a moment, assessing. He met her gaze without flinching, without the patronizing reassurance she had half expected, without anything that suggested he thought she needed rescuing. He was simply offering to help, the way you offered to help a neighbor whose fence had come down in a storm. "All right," she said. "I'd be grateful." He nodded and left before the students arrived, and Anna turned back to her blackboard and wrote the arithmetic problems in her clearest hand and told herself she had not watched him ride away. She had. The following week, Isaac returned to the schoolroom at the end of the school day, not to bring news of the vandal. Though he had identified him as the son of a local cattle rancher who objected to women in professional positions, and who was dealt with quietly but firmly by his own father once Isaac laid out the situation, but to ask if Tommy was keeping up with the lessons. Anna invited him in and showed him Tommy's writing samples, which were improving steadily, and his arithmetic results, which were excellent. Isaac stood beside her at the desk, close enough that she could smell horses and leather and something faintly like cedar, and he looked at his nephew's work with a pride so genuine, and undefended that it completely dismantled whatever professional distance Anna had been maintaining. "He's very bright," she said. "He is," Isaac agreed. "His mother, my sister Ellen, she died 2 years ago. Fever. His father went to California after that and didn't come back. Tommy has been with me ever since." He said it plainly without seeking sympathy, which meant she gave it freely rather than out of obligation. "I'm sorry about your sister," she said. "She was a good woman," he said. He looked up from the papers and found her watching him with the kind of open attention she usually reserved for books. He looked slightly surprised by it, and then, very slowly, he smiled. It was a quiet smile, the kind that built gradually rather than appearing all at once, and it made the serious lines of his face into something altogether different. "Would you have dinner with me?" he asked. "At the hotel restaurant, if you're willing. Not as I only mean to say thank you for what you're doing for Tommy. And for the town." "I would like that," Anna said, and was somewhat surprised to find that she meant it entirely. They had dinner at the Caldwell Hotel on a Saturday evening in late April, and it ran 3 hours longer than either of them planned because they could not stop talking. She told him about Philadelphia, about her father's bookshop, about the way she had grown up surrounded by the smell of old paper and the sound of her father reading aloud to customers on slow afternoons. He told her about growing up on the ranch his parents had established in 1861, about learning to ride before he could read, about his father dying when Isaac was 18, and the decision he had made to stay and build the ranch into something his parents would have recognized. She asked him about the land, and he described it with a love so specific and detailed that she could see it, the grass that went silver in the wind, the creek that ran along the southern edge of the property, the way the sky sat on the horizon like a weight you could lean into. She asked him about cattle ranching, and he answered without condescension, without simplifying. And when she asked sharp follow-up questions, he answered those too with what was clearly genuine pleasure at being asked. He asked about her books and did not glaze over when she answered. He asked about Philadelphia and listened to the stories. He asked about her students, one by one, and remembered what she said about each of them. By the end of the evening she had the distinct and slightly unnerving feeling that he was the kind of man who paid close attention to things that mattered to him. Walking her back to the boarding house through the spring evening, he said, "I'd like to do this again if you'd allow it." "I'd allow it," she said, and there was just enough of a smile in her voice that he caught it and smiled too, looking at the ground as they walked. "Saturday next," he said. "Saturday next," she agreed. The courtship that followed was unhurried in the way of a man who was not going to rush something important, and thorough in the way of a woman who, for all her reading of romantic novels, had never actually been courted, and found that the real thing was stranger and better and more nerve-wracking than any book had suggested. He brought Tommy to the school for extra help on Wednesday afternoons and stayed on the steps while the lesson ran, and sometimes she could see him through the window, turning his hat in his hands or reading a newspaper with the particular stillness of a man waiting for something he was genuinely glad to be waiting for. He brought her a book he had found at the general store, a collection of natural history essays with no fanfare. Just left it on her desk one morning with a note that said only, "Thought you might like this," in a handwriting that was better than she expected, steady and clear and slightly old-fashioned. She read the book twice and left it on his saddle the following morning with a note that said, "You were right," and listed her 3 favorite passages with brief annotations. He appeared at the schoolroom that afternoon with the book in hand, having read all 3 passages and formed opinions about all of them, and what was supposed to be a 5-minute exchange on the school steps turned into 45 minutes of the best conversation she had had in months. She thought about him more than was strictly rational. She thought about the way his eyes went a shade darker when he was fully engaged with a problem, and the way he stood steady, unhurried, taking up exactly as much space as he occupied and not an inch more. She thought about his laugh, which was rare and therefore wonderful when it appeared. She thought about his hands, which were the hands of a man who worked hard and cared for things carefully, and then she told herself firmly to stop thinking about his hands. She thought about his hands. By June, the town had developed opinions. Mrs. Cobb mentioned, with studied neutrality, that Isaac Carson was a good man with a solid reputation and no bad habits that anyone had been able to find. Dora Hicks told her, with complete directness, that if she had any sense she would pay attention to that man because men like Isaac Carson did not come along twice in a lifetime. 3 of her students, including Tommy, began drawing pictures of horses and presenting them to her at the end of the school day with the grave sincerity of children who have decided to be helpful. Tommy himself said, one Wednesday afternoon after his extra lesson, "My uncle talks about you at dinner." "Does he?" Anna said, keeping her voice carefully neutral. "He says you're the smartest person he's met in Caldwell," Tommy said. "I asked if that included Sheriff Hobbs, and he said especially Sheriff Hobbs." She bit the inside of her cheek to keep from smiling. "You should finish your letters," she said. "I heard him tell the foreman you were pretty too," Tommy said, and then opened his slate with the innocent expression of a 9-year-old who knows exactly what he's done. That Saturday evening, sitting across from Isaac at the hotel restaurant with the last of the spring sun coming through the window and turning everything warm gold, Anna looked at him and made a decision. "I've been told," she said, "that you called me smart." He looked up from the menu. His expression shifted through something quickly amusement, slight embarrassment, something warmer, before settling into the composed stillness he usually wore. "Tommy has a large mouth," he said. "He also told me about the pretty remark." Isaac set down the menu. He looked at her with those dark eyes that paid attention to things, and he said, "Both things are true, and I'm not going to apologize for them." Her heart did something completely unreasonable. She looked at the table and then back at him and said, "That's very forthright of you." "I try to be honest about things that matter," he said. Are you telling me this matters to you?" He was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke his voice was steady, but she could hear something careful in it, the way you carry something precious. "What I feel when I'm around you doesn't have a category yet," he said, "but whatever it is, yes, it matters to me." She reached across the table and put her hand over his, and when his turned and held hers with a gentle certainty that was absolutely everything, she understood that she was in serious trouble in the best possible way. The summer of 1878 was hot and full of cattle drives, and the particular chaos that descended on Caldwell every time a large herd came up from Texas on the Kishom Trail. The town filled with cowboys and their noise, and the streets were thick with dust and horses and commerce. Anna kept the schoolroom cool with wet cloths on the windows and taught her students through the upheaval with a consistency that earned her a deep and specific gratitude from the parents of Caldwell, who needed their children safe and occupied while the town did its seasonal business. Isaac's ranch was busy too, and there were weeks in July when she saw him only briefly. A wave from horseback as he passed through town, a note left at the boarding house, one Sunday afternoon when he appeared at the school to help her repair a window that had come loose in a summer storm, and stayed for 2 hours while they talked, side by side on the schoolhouse steps, watching the storm move away across the flat Kansas sky. It was on that same Sunday afternoon that the trouble with the Garrett brothers arrived in Caldwell. The Garrett brothers, 3 of them, all employed by a large cattle operation based further south, had a history in the county that Isaac explained to her quietly when they heard the shouting from the direction of the main street. Jed Garrett, the oldest, was known for aggressive land disputes. His younger brothers, Cole and Tanner, had been involved in an altercation with a local farmer the previous year over water rights that had turned ugly. "What do they want in Caldwell?" Anna asked. "The same thing they always want," Isaac said, "other people's things." The dispute this time was with a family named Vargas, Carlos Vargas, who had homesteaded a section of land east of town 5 years earlier and built a small but productive operation with his wife, Rosa, and their 3 children. 2 of those children, Maria and little Carlos Jr., were Anna's students. The Garrett brothers had decided that the Vargas section was land they wanted for grazing rights, and they were not going about making this clear in any legal or peaceful way. It was Sheriff Hobbs who handled the immediate confrontation, with a deputy on each side of him, and the quiet authority of a man who had been doing this for 15 years. The Garrett brothers were loud and unpleasant, and eventually went to the saloon to sulk, and the legal threat to the Vargas land did not disappear, but it moved from the street into the county courthouse, which was the appropriate venue. Isaac spent the next several days helping Carlos Vargas gather the documents that established his homestead claim, riding between the ranch and town, with the grim focus of a man who understood that the paperwork fight was as important as any other kind. Anna, for her part, spent those same days being entirely certain that what she felt for Isaac Carson was not a passing attraction or a consequence of proximity or loneliness in a new town. It was the real thing, fully formed, and it had crept up on her with the patience of a Kansas summer, gradual and total, and once arrived, absolutely definitive. She said as much to him on the evening that Carlos Vargas's homestead claim was formally filed and recorded at the county courthouse, when Isaac appeared at the boarding house door with his hat in his hand, and the relief of a man who has kept a promise in his eyes. "You're a good man," she said, standing on the porch in the evening air. "I'm a decent man," he said, with the precision of someone who cared about the distinction. "I try to be. That distinction matters to you." "I've known men who called themselves good and weren't," he said. "Decent is something you can actually measure." She looked at him in the way she had been looking at him all summer, the way that she knew he was aware of because she had seen what it did to his composure, the very slight tightening of his jaw, the way his hands stilled. "I love you," she said. The words came out entirely without plan, which was not characteristic of her, but they were completely true, and she found she did not want to take them back. Isaac Carson stood very still on the porch of Mrs. Cobb's boarding house in the blue summer evening with his hat in his hands, and then he stepped forward and took her face in both his hands with a gentleness so absolute that her heart simply broke open and reformed around it. "I love you," he said, very quietly, looking at her with everything visible, nothing held back. "I have been trying to figure out how to say it without frightening you away." "I'm not easily frightened," she reminded him. "No," he said, and smiled, and then he kissed her for the first time softly, with the kind of care that felt like a promise, and the summer evening went entirely golden around them. August arrived with a heat that sat on the Kansas plains like a hand pressing down, and the happiness that had settled over Anna's daily life was the kind that made even the difficult things feel manageable. The 3 boys in her class who could not stop fighting, the ongoing legal maneuvering around the Vargas property, the heat that made the schoolroom an oven by noon each day. Isaac had begun speaking, carefully at first and then with increasing directness, about the future, about the ranch, about what he wanted it to become, about Tommy growing up on land he could call home. He had not said everything explicitly, but she understood the shape of what he was building toward, and she found that what she felt about that shape was not anxiety but something warm and resolute. She had not planned on falling in love in Kansas. She had not planned on cattle drives and courtship on school steps and a man who argued about natural history essays and showed up to help strangers file paperwork. She had planned on being a schoolteacher, competent and independent and sufficient. She was still all of those things. She was also irrevocably in love. It was Tommy who presented the issue first, as Tommy tended to present things directly and without awareness that he might be causing difficulty. "If you marry my uncle," Tommy said one Wednesday afternoon, having finished his letters ahead of schedule and apparently decided that the extra time was appropriate for personal questions, "will you still be my teacher?" Anna looked up from the paper she was reviewing. "What makes you ask that?" "Because Mrs. Harrison stopped being a teacher when she got married," Tommy said. "She said married women couldn't be teachers because they had to run a house." Anna was quiet for a moment, because this was a real thing and not a simple thing. The school board in Caldwell had not been explicit about their policy, but she had known since before she came, that many towns expected female teachers to be unmarried. It was one of the many injustices that ran through the structure of her world, with the matter-of-fact cruelty of things that had never been questioned. "I don't know yet," she said honestly, "but I promise that whatever happens, your education is something that I care about very much, and I will make sure you are learning." Tommy accepted this with the pragmatic trust of a child who has learned not to hold too tightly to arrangements he cannot control. And Anna spent the rest of that afternoon thinking about a problem she had been carefully not thinking about. That evening she sat across from Isaac at the kitchen table in his ranch house. They had moved from the hotel restaurant to his kitchen table some weeks ago, in a natural progression that had been remarked upon by exactly everyone in Caldwell, and she told him what Tommy had said. Isaac listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she loved about him. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "What do you want?" "I want to keep teaching," she said. I want what we are building, but I don't want to have to choose between them." "Then don't choose," he said, "or rather choose both and let the school board deal with the fact that they have an excellent teacher who is also married. It's not that simple." "No," he said, "it isn't. But Dora Hicks runs that school board, and Dora Hicks is the most practical woman I've ever met. She knows what she has in you. I think you should talk to her." "Are you asking me to marry you?" she said. "Because if you are, you're being very indirect about it." He looked at her across the kitchen table in the lamplight, and then he stood up from his chair and went to the shelf above the fireplace and took down a small box that she had seen there before and wondered about. He opened it and set it on the table between them. Inside was a ring, a simple gold band with a small garnet, old and very clearly his mother's. "Anna Ralston," he said, "I would very much like you to marry me. I will support whatever you decide about teaching, and I will fight the school board if they try to take your classroom from you, and I will love you for the rest of my life. But I want to be your husband if you'll have me." She looked at the ring and then at him, and then she said, "Yes," with the full force of everything she was, and he slid his mother's ring onto her finger, and then she pulled him toward her and kissed him with no gentleness at all, and he laughed against her mouth, startled and delighted, and then kissed her back just as thoroughly. The conversation with Dora Hicks happened the following week, and it was not simple, but Isaac had been right about Dora's practicality. The school board chairman had raised his objection within 30 seconds, but Dora had looked at him with the expression of a woman who has heard every argument and found them all wanting, and said that she was not in the business of driving away qualified teachers over the marital status of someone who was already engaged, and that the school board would be reconsidering its policy before the autumn term, and that if the chairman wished to debate this further, she had prepared several documents outlining the educational outcomes under Anna's instruction, which were, she said, objectively excellent. The policy was reconsidered. Anna would keep her classroom. She went directly from that meeting to the schoolroom, where she stood in the middle of the room she loved, the desks, the blackboard, the globe on its stand, and felt something settle inside her that had been slightly unsettled since the day she arrived, the last small knot of uncertainty about what exactly she had been brave enough to build dissolving quietly in the afternoon light. They married in October, in the small church on the east end of Caldwell, on a Saturday when the whole town seemed to have found reasons to be in the vicinity of the church at 11 in the morning. The wedding was not elaborate, but it was real. Dora Hicks in the front row with her husband, Sheriff Hobbs in his best vest, Carlos and Rosa Vargas with all three of their children, Mrs. Cobb looking on with the expression of a woman who had been right about something and was too dignified to say so. Tommy sat in the front row in a new shirt, and the only time he took his eyes off the ceremony was when he turned around to check if the man he had decided was his best friend, the ranch foreman Hector Delgado, was still there. Hector was there. Isaac stood at the front of the church looking at her as she walked toward him with the expression of a man who could not quite believe his own luck and was not going to waste a moment of it. She walked toward him with her auburn hair pinned up with small white flowers and her father's ring on her right hand and her mother-in-law's ring waiting on her left, and she thought, "This is the best thing I have ever walked toward." They said their vows with complete steadiness, both of them, the way you do when you mean every word. The reception was held in the street outside the church, because the church was too small for Caldwell's enthusiasm, and there was music and food, and the particular chaotic warmth of a community celebrating one of its own. Isaac danced with her in the open air with a straightforwardness that suggested he was a man who knew his own limitations and had made peace with them, which she found enormously endearing. Tommy danced with every woman who would have him and several who hadn't planned to. Carlos Vargas played the guitar and Rosa sang, and the autumn evening was golden and cool and smelled of cedar smoke and baked bread and the last of the summer grass. When they finally made their way out to the ranch house, their ranch house now, her bedroom at Mrs. Cobb's having been packed up 2 days earlier with great efficiency and some sentiment, the night was full of stars and quiet. She stood on the porch and looked out at the dark land around her, the vast flat Kansas dark broken by the light from the barn and the sound of horses shifting in their stalls. And Isaac came and stood behind her and wrapped his arms around her, and they stayed like that for a long time, neither of them needing to speak. "It's very big," she said finally, meaning the land, the sky, the overwhelming horizontal fact of the prairie at night. "You'll get used to it," he said. "I already love it," she said, surprising herself slightly. She felt him smile against her hair. The first winter on the ranch was the great instructor. Anna had been cold in Philadelphia, but she had never been cold the way you were cold on the Kansas plains in January, when the wind came down from the north and the snow lay flat and hard and the temperature dropped to things that made your breath freeze before it left your lips. Isaac had prepared as methodically as he did everything else, wood stacked high. Livestock moved close, extra feed in the barn, storm shutters on the windows. But even so, there were days when the world reduced to the square of warmth they made inside the house, and nothing else existed. She had not expected to love those days as much as she did. The smallness of the world in a snowstorm turned out to suit something in her that she had not known was there. Some desire for a life that fit exactly inside your arm's reach. She graded papers at the kitchen table while Isaac worked on ledgers or repaired harness or sat and read, and Tommy did his homework on the floor by the fire with the dog, a large patient animal named Gus, lying alongside him, and the lamp threw its yellow light over everything, and Anna thought, this is the life. Not the life she had planned or imagined or read about. The actual life made of actual things. School resumed in February when the worst of the weather broke, and Anna was back at her blackboard with 12 faces 14, as 2 new families had arrived during the winter looking up at her, and she taught them reading and writing and arithmetic, and where she could manage it, the kind of thinking that went underneath all of those things. How to ask a question, how to sit with not knowing the answer, how to argue a point and then listen when someone argued back. She taught Maria Vargas to write a sentence that sang, and she taught Tommy the multiplication tables by setting them to a rhythm he could tap on his desk, and she taught a 6-year-old newcomer named Bess Calloway to read her first full sentence, and watched the child's face ignite with the particular astonishment that comes when the marks on the page suddenly become meaning, which was still, after all of it, the thing that made Anna most certain she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Spring came back slowly and then all at once, the way it did on the plains, and with it came new growth and new problems. The legal dispute over the Vargas land had moved through the county court system with the grinding patience of all legal processes, and the Garrett brothers had lost their claim. The homestead documentation had been solid, and the judge had been no nonsense, but losing had made them ugly in the way that men who expect to win become ugly when they don't. The ugly came to a head on a Wednesday morning when Cole Garrett, the middle brother, appeared at the schoolroom door during lessons with a grievance about Carlos Vargas that he apparently felt the schoolteacher could do something about. He was not violent, but he was loud and intrusive, and the children were frightened. And Anna met him in the doorway and held the door shut behind her and told him, with a calm that she assembled from everything she had, that this was a classroom and he would leave now. He looked at her with the contempt of a man who did not take women seriously, and therefore continued to be surprised when they did not yield. And then he looked past her at the room full of children and some remaining shred of whatever had once been decency, made him step back and leave. She stood on the school steps until he had gone, and then she went back inside and returned to the lesson as though nothing had happened, because the children needed to see that the normal world continued, and it did, and it would. She sent a note to Isaac, not because she needed rescuing, because he was her husband and she wanted him to know what had happened from her, not from town gossip. He appeared at the schoolroom at end of day with the careful expression of a man managing a strong emotion, and she told him everything plainly, and he listened, and then he said, "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said. "The children, shaken but fine. Maria Vargas was the bravest." She sat completely still and watched him with these very steady eyes. "I'm going to make sure her parents know how well she handled herself." Isaac was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I'll speak to Sheriff Hobbs." "I've already sent a message to him," she said. He looked at her, and there it was again, that thing she had first seen on the school steps the day they met, the assessment, the slight recalibration, the recognition. "Of course you have," he said. "You say that like it surprises you," she said. "It doesn't," he said. "It's one of the things I love most about you." Cole Garrett left Caldwell the following week, under circumstances that involved a very pointed conversation with Sheriff Hobbs and a strong suggestion from the county that the Garrett brothers' continued presence in the area was unwelcome. Jed Garrett made noise about returning, but the noise was at a distance, and by April it faded entirely. The spring of 1879 brought other things besides the departure of the Garrett brothers. It brought a circuit preacher who stayed for 3 days, and held a revival that the whole town attended out of a mixture of genuine faith and the social appeal of everyone being in one place at once. It brought a dry goods shipment that included, to Anna's profound delight, 3 new reading primers and a box of fresh chalk. It brought the Vargases' 4th child, a healthy boy they named Isaac, at Rose's insistence, which made Carlos beam and made Isaac himself look away with the slightly undone expression of a man moved more deeply than he wanted anyone to see. And it brought the morning in late May when Anna, standing in the kitchen before school, told Isaac quietly that she was expecting a child. He sat down. He was not a man who sat down without reason, and seeing it happen, the way the news simply took his legs out made her feel the full weight of it herself, the real enormous significance of what they were saying to each other across the kitchen. "When?" he said. "November, I think." He looked at her for a long moment, and there was everything in his face, wonder and fear and love, and the responsible calculation of a man who immediately began working through what needed to be done. And then he stood up and crossed the kitchen and held her, very carefully, the way you hold something you cannot quite believe you have. How are you feeling?" he said, against her hair. "I'm feeling like I need to get to school," she said, "and also somewhat as though the world has just become very much larger." "That's about right," he said, and held her for another moment before letting her go. She taught through the spring and the summer, making accommodations as needed, and the school board again demonstrated its pragmatism, and Dora Hicks again demonstrated her particular talent for making decisions before anyone else could make them poorly. She would teach through October and then take leave through the winter, and a substitute had been arranged. Tommy, who was 10 now and entirely accustomed to being the center of whatever emotional weather system surrounded the adults in his life, received the news about the baby with a solemnity that then broke immediately into a bright, wide grin. "I'm going to be a cousin," he announced, as if this were a rank he had been campaigning for. "You are," Isaac said. "Is it a boy or a girl?" "We don't know yet," Anna said. Tommy considered this. "Either way is fine," he decided. I'll teach them to ride." "You will absolutely not teach a newborn to ride," Anna said. "When they're bigger," Tommy revised. "We'll discuss it," Isaac said, which was his standard response to things that were years away and therefore not urgent. The autumn was full and golden and busy, and when Anna handed over her classroom keys to the substitute teacher, a competent young man from Missouri named Mr. Pierce, she did so with the knowledge that she was handing them to someone temporary, and that they would come back to her in the spring, and that the two things she loved most in the world were not in competition, but simply in rotation, which was a kind of grace she had not been certain she would find when she had stepped off the stagecoach in Caldwell with her 2 bags and her stubbornness and her green eyes and nothing yet decided. The boy was born on a Thursday in November, strong and loud, and with a full head of dark hair that made Isaac look at Anna with an expression of laughing surprise. They named him Samuel for her father. Samuel James Carson, with his mother's green eyes and his father's jaw, and the particular imperious quality of someone who knows what he wants and sees no reason not to say so at full volume. Tommy held him with the extreme concentration of someone managing something precious and asked, twice, whether he could hold him again. The winter of 1879 was softer than the winter before, and the house was different with a baby in it, smaller and warmer and full of a different kind of noise. Anna found her world contracting and expanding simultaneously, in the particular way of new motherhood that she had not been able to understand from the outside. She read to Samuel from the natural history essays that had begun their correspondence, not because he could understand them, but because he seemed to find her voice calming, and because she refused to talk down to someone simply because they were small. Isaac watched her do this with the expression he wore when she did something that he loved without having been able to predict it, which was the expression she worked hardest to produce. She was back at her classroom by April of 1880, with Samuel in the care of Rosa Vargas during school hours, an arrangement that suited everyone and that had been Rosa's suggestion, offered with such natural generosity that Anna had understood immediately why Carlos Vargas was such a happy man. Tommy, who had turned 11 and shot up 3 inches during the winter, resumed his Wednesday extra lessons with the enthusiasm of someone who had discovered, over the winter, that he was good at mathematics and found this personally satisfying. Life in Caldwell in 1880 was different from what it had been when Anna arrived 2 years earlier. The town was growing new houses on the north end, a new mercantile, a second saloon that nobody had asked for but everyone expected. The cattle drives were changing too. Isaac talked about it with Carlos and the other ranchers, about the railroads pushing further west and how the trail drives would not last forever. The land was being parceled and fenced and claimed, and the wide-open quality of the early cattle trail era was already beginning to close like a hand. Isaac was thinking about the future of the ranch in a way that was more complex than simple expansion. He talked to Anna about it in the evenings after Samuel was asleep, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp burning, working through what the ranch could become as the cattle economy changed. Horses, he thought. Breeding and training quality horses for the ranches and the army. The land was right for it, and he had a talent for it that he had not fully developed because cattle had been the obvious thing. She asked questions and he answered them, and she asked more questions, and eventually she said, "You've already decided, haven't you? You're just working out how to say it." He looked at her with those dark eyes. "Maybe," he said. "Say it," she said. "I want to shift the ranch to horses," he said. "It'll take 3 years to do it properly. We'll keep some cattle, but the focus, the real work will be horses." "Then do it," she said. "It's a risk." "Everything worth doing is a risk," she said. "You know this land and you know horses, and you're not an impulsive man. The risk is calculated." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, the same gesture she had made that first evening at the hotel restaurant, now returned in kind. "Have I told you today that I love you?" he said. "This morning," she said, "but I don't have an objection to hearing it again." "I love you," he said. "I love you," she said. "Now let's work out the numbers." The transition of the Carson Ranch began in the autumn of 1880, and it was a long, gradual, carefully managed process that took more than the 3 years Isaac had projected and was worth every day of the time it required. Isaac threw himself into it with the methodical dedication that was the core of who he was, and the ranch began to change its character slowly, season by season, like a river that shifts its course without anyone seeing the exact moment of change. Tommy, who had decided by the age of 12 that horses were the greatest thing in the world and who had an uncanny natural ability with them, became his uncle's most enthusiastic assistant and his best audience. He spent every hour that was not school under Isaac's supervision in the training paddock, learning by watching and then by doing, developing a patience with horses that Anna recognized as the same patience Isaac had applied to everything else in his life. The school continued to grow with the town. By 1881, Anna had 17 students and a second teacher's assistant, a young woman named Clara Worth, who had come to Caldwell with her family and who turned out to have the gift for it, the ability to be fully present to a child's confusion without losing confidence in the child's capacity to understand. Anna mentored Clara with the same thoroughness she brought to everything, and the schoolroom became a place that the children of Caldwell's increasingly diverse population, children of cattle ranchers, homesteaders, former soldiers, Mexican families, freed black families who had moved north seeking land, came to and were taught with equal seriousness and respect. There were difficulties with that too. Not everyone in Caldwell in 1881 agreed that a schoolroom should serve all children equally, and Anna faced that argument with the full force of her stubbornness and her conviction, and a support from Dora Hicks that never wavered. The children came and they learned and they grew, and whatever the adults fought about outside the schoolroom walls, inside it the rule was simple. You are here to learn and you will be treated as someone capable of learning, and that is the end of the matter. Samuel took his first steps in the kitchen of the ranch house on a Tuesday afternoon in March of 1881, and the expression on Isaac's face when it happened was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen on him, pure, helpless joy, the kind that doesn't know how to contain itself and doesn't try. He grabbed Samuel up and held him overhead, and Samuel crowed with delight, and Tommy, who had been watching from the doorway, cheered, and Gus the dog barked, and the kitchen was full of an enormous, ordinary happiness. The summer of 1881 brought a drought that tested everyone, the land and the people both, in the way that droughts do, slowly, then all at once. The creek on the south end of the ranch dropped to a trickle, and the grass went brittle and brown, and the horses needed water that had to be hauled from the town well. Isaac and Hector and Tommy worked through it with the steady focus of people who know that panic is expensive, and effort is the only currency that matters in a drought. Anna ran the schoolroom through the heat with wet cloths and open windows, and made sure every child who came in the morning left at the end of the day having drunk enough water, because there were families in the county where the drought was hitting harder than others, and she was not going to let a child go home thirsty if she could do anything about it. The rains came in September, late and generous, and the land recovered with the resilience that Anna had learned to expect from the Kansas plains, quietly, without acknowledgement, simply returning to itself as though the difficulty had been a digression rather than a permanent state. In October of 1881, Anna discovered she was expecting again. She told Isaac in the same kitchen where she had told him about Samuel, and he sat down again, and she loved him entirely for that, for the fact that the news still required sitting, still landed with its full weight, was not diminished by having happened once before. "November again?" he asked. "July this time," she said. He stood up and crossed the kitchen and held her, and this time she put her arms around him and held back with equal force, and they stood like that in the kitchen with the autumn evening coming through the window and Samuel asleep in the next room, and the sound of Tommy singing something badly in the barn, And Anna thought, I have built the most beautiful life imaginable in the most unexpected place, and I would not trade it for anything in the world. The second child was a boy too. They named him James, for Isaac's father, and he was quieter than Samuel from the first hour, with his father's dark eyes and a thoughtful quality that suggested he was already considering the world carefully before deciding what to make of it. Tommy held him with more confidence this time, having established that he was trustworthy with small people, and Samuel regarded his new brother with the intense suspicion of a nearly 2-year-old encountering something that has usurped his position as the most interesting thing in the room. The rivalry was short-lived. Samuel was too interested in everything to maintain a grievance for long, and James, who grew into the world with the same patient attention as his father, was entirely willing to adore his older brother, which settled the matter. Caldwell in 1882 and 1883 was a different town from the Caldwell of 1878, in all the ways that towns change when they grow and consolidate and begin to look less like a frontier outpost and more like a place where people intend to stay for the rest of their lives. The great cattle drives were slowing. The open range was giving way to fenced homesteads. The railroads had changed everything about commerce and connection, and the particular wildness of the early cattle trail era was becoming memory faster than anyone expected. Isaac's horse operation was thriving by 1883. The 3-year projection had run to nearly 5, but the ranch was producing quality horses that were sought out by buyers from across the region, and Isaac's reputation as someone who bred and trained honest, capable animals was solid enough that it was generating its own momentum. Tommy, at 14, was his most skilled trainer, with a way with horses that went beyond technique into something instinctive and genuine. Isaac was already thinking about what that would mean for the ranch when Tommy was grown. Anna had been teaching in Caldwell for 5 years by the spring of 1883, and what she had built in that schoolroom was something she was quietly and unabashedly proud of. Clara Worth was now a full teacher in her own right, and they ran the schoolroom as partners with a division of responsibility that played to both their strengths, and the children of Caldwell's growing population were receiving an education that Anna believed would hold them. She still felt the same thing she had felt since the first day she set foot in the room, the certainty that this was where she was supposed to be, doing exactly this. And she had learned over 5 years that this certainty was not something to take lightly, because it was rare and it was precious, and it was the foundation of everything else. Isaac brought her wildflowers from the south field on a Saturday in May of 1883, a thing he had been doing in various forms since they were courting, some token of the land, a particular stone, a hawk feather, a cluster of wildflowers with no occasion and no explanation needed, simply the gesture of a man who paid attention to what the world offered and thought of her when it offered something beautiful. She put the flowers in a blue glass bottle on the kitchen windowsill and stood looking at them for a moment, and then she turned and looked at him. This man she had built her life with, who was standing in the kitchen doorway in his work clothes with his hat pushed back and those dark eyes on her. This man she had loved for 5 years and expected to love for 50 more, and she felt it fully, the whole accumulated weight and warmth of their life together, without reservation. "What?" he said, because she was looking at him with an intensity that would have unsettled a more nervous man. "Nothing," she said. "Everything. I was just looking at my life." He came across the kitchen and stood in front of her and looked at her the same way, with the full attention he had always given to things that mattered to him. "Is it what you wanted?" he said. Not anxiously, it was a real question, the question of a man who wanted to know. "It's better than what I wanted," she said. "I didn't know how to want this specifically. I just wanted something real." He picked up her left hand, his mother's ring on her finger, 5 years worn now and fully hers, and pressed his lips to her knuckles with the formality and tenderness of someone marking something important. "So did I," he said. The years that followed settled into a pattern that was full and changing and never quite routine, because life on the Carson ranch with two small boys and a growing horse operation, and a schoolteacher who treated the world as a set of problems worth solving was never going to be routine, and neither of them would have had it any other way. Samuel at 4 was a force of nature curious about absolutely everything, with a bravery that was not recklessness but the specific courage of a child who trusts the world to be interesting, who climbs the fence not to be defiant, but because the other side is also interesting. James at 2 was his shadow and his balance. Where Samuel ran, James watched, and where James sat still, Samuel moved, and together they made a complete thing that made Isaac and Anna look at each other over their heads with the helpless gratitude of parents who know they have been given something extraordinary. Tommy at 15 was already better with horses than most grown men, and Isaac had begun talking to him about the future of the ranch with the seriousness of a man who was no longer talking to a boy. Tommy received this with the same seriousness, which told Anna everything she needed to know about the young man he was becoming, his mother's son in his warmth, his father's son in his absence, and something entirely his own in the capacity he had developed to belong to a place and a people without clinging to either. The school continued to be her anchor in the world outside the house. In 1884, she had 23 students and a classroom that had expanded to accommodate them, with new desks built by the town carpenter and a second blackboard mounted on the east wall. She had been teaching in Caldwell for 6 years by then, and the children of some of her earliest students were beginning to appear in the classroom. It was beginning to show her the span of what she was doing, the generational reach of teaching well in a place where people stayed and put down roots and had children of their own. Maria Vargas came back to help with the younger students one afternoon a week, at 16, already showing the thoughtful exactness of someone who would make a fine teacher herself. Anna encouraged this with the same directness she applied to everything. "You have a gift for it," she told Maria. "Don't be modest about it." "My mother says I argue like you do," Maria said. "Your mother is paying you a compliment," Anna said. Carlos Vargas came to the schoolroom one afternoon that autumn and told Anna, with Rosa beside him and both of them slightly formal with the weight of what they were saying, that the education Anna had given their children had changed the course of their family, and that they wanted her to know this, and that they were grateful in a way that they did not quite have adequate words for. Anna thanked them with complete sincerity and told them that their children had done the work, and then she went home and told Isaac about it and felt the tears come briefly and allowed them, because some things were worth crying about. He sat beside her on the porch steps in the evening and put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and they watched the stars come out over the Kansas prairie, the big western dark filling up with light, and there was nothing that needed to be said. The winter of 1884 brought Tommy's 16th birthday, and a conversation that had been building for months. Isaac sat down with Tommy at the kitchen table one January evening. Anna was there too, because these were conversations that happened with everyone present in their household, which was one of the things Tommy had come to understand was different about his uncle's house from what he had known before, and laid out the future of the ranch as he saw it. He spoke about the horse operation and what it would need in 10 years and 20 years, and he spoke about Tommy's role in it not as an employee but as a partner, someone who would inherit a stake in the ranch when he came of age, a thing that had been decided quietly between Isaac and Anna long ago and confirmed by a document filed with the county. He spoke about the investment of the coming years, the learning, the responsibility, the work, and asked Tommy if this was what he wanted. Tommy was quiet for a long moment, which was unusual for him, and when he spoke his voice was not quite steady. "You didn't have to do this," he said. "I know," Isaac said. "I'm your nephew. You took me in because my mother was your sister. You didn't have to make me a partner." "I made you a partner because you've earned it," Isaac said, "and because this is your home and has been for 4 years, and because I want you to know that you belong here, Not just while you're a boy, for as long as you want to be here." Tommy looked at the table and then looked at Anna, who was watching him with the open honesty that she had always given him, never filtering what he could see in her face because she believed he deserved to see it. "Thank you," he said to both of them, and it was the kind of thank you that meant something entirely different from and larger than the words. By the spring of 1885, the Carson Ranch had completed its full transition to the horse operation that Isaac had envisioned, and its reputation had spread across the county and into the neighboring ones. The horses they bred and trained were sought out for their reliability and their even temperament, and the operation was solid and growing, and Isaac allowed himself, on a spring evening watching a 3-year-old bay mare move through her paces in the paddock with Tommy at the lead, the particular satisfaction of a man who has built something good. Samuel had started school that spring, marching into Anna's classroom on his first day with the proprietary air of someone who has been told good things about this place and expects them to be true. The other children looked at him with curiosity. He looked back with interest. "That's my son," Anna said to Clara Worth quietly, watching through the window. "He looks like Isaac," Clara said. "He acts like me," Anna said, and Clara laughed. James would start the following year, and Anna was already thinking about how to calibrate herself. The particular challenge of teaching your own child with the same objectivity you apply to everyone else, without either harshness or indulgence, both of which would be unfair. She thought she could manage it, and she thought Isaac would tell her if she couldn't, which was one of the great gifts of their marriage, the willingness to be honestly seen. The summer of 1885 was the summer Tommy fell in love, which nobody was surprised about except Tommy, who had apparently assumed that the girl who helped her father at the mercantile was simply a very interesting person to talk to and had not connected this to anything. Her name was Eleanor Marsh, 17 to Tommy's 17, with red hair and a very quick mind and opinions about horses that she expressed without hesitation and that Tommy found fascinating. She had arrived in Caldwell the previous autumn with her family, who had come from Missouri with money and ambition, and a plan to establish the dry goods business they were already successfully running. Isaac noticed before Tommy did. He mentioned it to Anna with the brief economy of a man stating an observed fact, and Anna mentioned it to no one because she understood that these things need to develop in their own time without the interference of well-meaning adults. By August, Tommy and Eleanor were regularly to be found in the mercantile, or on its steps, or walking the length of the main street in the early evening with the careful, slightly formal closeness of two young people who are aware of each other in a way that cannot be put back. "Should we say something?" Isaac said. "Absolutely not," Anna said. "Give it until autumn." By autumn, Tommy had worked up the courage to speak to Mr. Marsh, with Isaac beside him, which was the done thing, and Eleanor had worked up the courage to tell her mother, who had noticed and was cautiously pleased, and the young pair were formally courting by November to the enormous satisfaction of everyone who had been patiently watching and saying nothing. Anna watched Tommy navigate this new territory with the full-hearted vulnerability of a young man discovering that love is enormous and slightly terrifying, and she remembered sitting across from Isaac at the hotel restaurant in the spring of 1878, unable to stop talking, with the same sensation of the world becoming simultaneously larger and more specific, and she felt for Tommy the particular empathy of someone who knows exactly where he is and is glad he's found it. The years of the late 1880s settled the Carson household into something that was complete without being static, always changing, always growing, never quite the same from one season to the next, but built on a foundation that held. Samuel grew into a boy who loved the school with the same love his mother had always brought to it, which made Anna quietly certain that she had done something right, though she knew it was not entirely her doing. He had simply been born with curiosity and allowed to keep it, which was all it usually required. James, quieter and more interior, turned out to love horses the way Tommy did. And Tommy took him under his wing in the training paddock with the natural ease of someone who had been taught by example that teaching is one of the things you do with the knowledge you have. Tommy and Alina married in 1888, when both were 20, in the same church where Isaac and Anna had married 10 years before. Anna stood at the back of the church and watched Tommy take Alina's hand, with a steadiness that reminded her so completely of Isaac on their own wedding day, that she had to press her lips together and breathe very carefully to maintain her composure. Isaac stood beside her, and she felt him take her hand in his, and she held it tightly, and neither of them said anything, and everything was said. By 1890, Caldwell had fully shed its identity as a cattle trail town and become something different. A settled Kansas community with paved streets in the center, a proper bank, a doctor's office, a growing number of families who had been there for more than a decade and whose children were beginning to have children of their own. The wild, loud, unpredictable quality of the cattle drive years was gone, and Anna missed it sometimes. The energy and the chaos and the sense of something being made. But what had replaced it was the solidity of something actually made, a community that had chosen to become itself, and that was its own kind of satisfaction. She was 34 in 1890, and she had been teaching in Caldwell for 12 years, and the school had grown into a proper 2-room structure with 2 full teachers and an enrollment of 40 students. Clara Worth had become her equal in every professional sense and her close friend in every personal one, and the schoolroom was the thing Anna had promised herself she would build in a town in the West, and she had built it, and it stood. Isaac at 38 was the kind of man that the years had been good to, not untouched by them, but deepened and steadied, with more silver in his dark hair and the same dark eyes that still paid full attention to everything worth paying attention to. He had built the horse operation into something that Hector Delgado, who had been with the ranch since before Anna arrived and who was, in every way that mattered, family ran alongside him as a true partner. Tommy had taken on the training and breeding side with a skill that exceeded even what Isaac had hoped for, and the ranch had become known in the region as a producer of quality horses that could be trusted. He still brought her wildflowers from the South Field in May. She still left books on his desk with annotations in the margins. He still sat at the kitchen table late in the evening and worked through problems with the patient thoroughness that she had loved from the first time she saw it applied to Tommy's writing samples. She still looked at him, sometimes across a room, and felt the full original force of what she had felt in the spring of 1878, undiminished, just layered over with 12 years of knowing every room of who he was. "We should take the boys to the river this Sunday," she said one Friday evening in June of 1890, watching Isaac read at the kitchen table while Samuel and James argued amiably about something in the next room. "We should," he said, without looking up. "I'll pack food," she said. "I'll get the horses ready," he said. "Tommy and Alina should come. I'll ask him tomorrow." She looked at him for a moment, the lamplight on his face, the familiar line of his shoulders, the silver at his temples, and felt the gratitude arrive as it did regularly, enormous and specific. "Isaac," she said. He looked up. "I'm very glad I stepped off that stagecoach," she said. He looked at her with everything available, nothing withheld, the way he had looked at her on their wedding day and on every important day since then. "So am I," he said. "Every single day." On Sunday they rode to the river, Isaac and Anna, Samuel at 11 and James at 9, Tommy and Alina and their small daughter Nora, who was 2 and looked exactly like her mother, and had Tommy completely wrapped around her smallest finger. Hector came too, and his wife, Lucinda, who had arrived in Caldwell 4 years earlier and been absorbed into the extended Carson family with the naturalness of someone who fit. They spread blankets on the riverbank and ate the food Anna had packed and let the children run themselves breathless in the summer afternoon, and the river ran cool and clear over its stones, and the sky was the enormous Kansas blue that Anna had learned to love without reservation. Isaac sat beside her on the blanket with his back against a cottonwood tree, and his eyes closed in the sunlight, and she watched him rest with the kind of pleasure that comes from watching someone you love be, simply, at peace. His hand was on the blanket close to hers, and she laced her fingers through his, and he opened his eyes and looked at her. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "Everything," she said. 12 years. What about them?" "That they're the best 12 years of my life," she said, "and that I think the next 12 will be better." He squeezed her hand. "They will be," he said, with the certainty of a man who had made a promise and intended to keep it, who had said he would love her for the rest of his life and had meant every word of that from the moment it left his mouth. Samuel ran past them at full speed, yelling something at James, who chased him with the focused intent of a boy who would not be outrun for much longer. Nora shrieked with delight from Aline's arms. Hector laughed at something Lucinda said. Tommy was knee-deep in the river with his boots off, letting the current move around him, looking downstream with the calm, open expression of someone whose life had turned out to be something good and who knows it. Anna leaned her head on Isaac's shoulder and listened to all of it, the river and the children and the laughter and the summer afternoon, and she held onto her husband's hand, and she thought of the woman who had stepped off a stagecoach in Caldwell, Kansas in the spring of 1878 with 2 bags and a stubborn jaw and a heart that hadn't known yet what it was looking for. She had found it. It had found her. The 2 things had happened at the same time, which was how it always worked when it was the real thing. The evening came slowly, the way June evenings come on the Kansas plains, the light going golden and then rose, and then that particular blue that precedes the dark, and they gathered the blankets and the children and began the ride back to the ranch. Samuel rode with Isaac, settled in front of him in the saddle the way he had been riding since he was big enough to hold on, and James rode his own horse, a small, patient mare who had been trained specifically with James's quietness in mind, with the careful seriousness of someone taking a responsibility seriously. Tommy rode beside Anna on the way back, and they talked about the school and the ranch and Nora's new words and the horses they were training this season, and the future in the way that 2 people talk who have always been honest with each other and expect to go on being honest. He was 22 now, this boy she had taught, this nephew who had become family in every real sense of the word, and looking at him in the evening light, she felt the full span of what the years had made the accumulation of small moments and large decisions and daily ordinary love that had built something beautiful and solid and real. When they reached the ranch and the horses were settled in the barn and the children were inside and the lamps were lit, Isaac stood on the porch with Anna and watched the last of the light leave the sky. The stars came, the way they always did, slow and then all at once, the way the Kansas sky knew how to give things, everything at once and without reservation. "Good day," Isaac said. "Perfect day," Anna said. He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, and they stood on the porch of the house they had built their life in, under the stars that hung over everything, and the ranch was quiet and full and completely, entirely theirs. This was the life. Not the life she had planned, not the life she had read about or imagined in the back rooms of her father's bookshop in Philadelphia, not the life she had expected when she stepped off the stagecoach in Caldwell, Kansas in the spring of 1878 with 2 bags and no certainty except the certainty of her own stubbornness. The actual life, made of actual things. Made of Isaac and a schoolroom and wildflowers from the south field and 2 boys who argued and laughed and ran by the river, and Tommy who had grown into someone worth knowing, and the Vargas family and Hector and Lucinda and Clara, and all the children who had sat in her schoolroom and learned to read and write and think, and the big Kansas sky that sat on the horizon like something you could lean into. And this man who had paid attention to everything that mattered to him and let her be one of those things. It was better than anything she had planned. It was exactly right.